Okay, I'm gonna get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to, I think this is the ninth BGC Argo webinar series hosted by GO-BGC and the US OCB, the Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry program. Thank you very much for helping us host this OCB. It's been a very big success so far. Today's webinar is really, Ellen Park did she's hosting the seminar, and the topic is use of AI in using BGC Argo. So she'll go into that a little bit more. But yes, I'm going to give a quick intro and update on the GO-BGC program. John Sharp is going to have an announcement for a new exciting webinar series, and then we'll go into the talks. So that's all right, here we go. Okay, so BGC Argo is a part of the One Argo design, which is the next phase of Argo. The target array is 4,700 floats distributed evenly around the globe, which consists of 2,500 core floats, 1,200 deep floats, and 1,000 BGC floats shown in the green dots in this map here. And the array size of 1,000 BGC floats were determined through various exercises such as OSCEs and decorrelation length scales. And the rationale behind the 1,000 float array size can be found in the Biogeochemical Argo Science and Implementation Plan. We are currently in the process of updating this plan, and hopefully the updated version will be out in the next year or so, something like that. The GO-BGC, or the Global Ocean Biogeochemistry Array, is a National Science Foundation funded mid-scale research infrastructure 2 project. And so this was designed to be the US contribution to the global BGC Argo array. So historically, the US has deployed and maintained half of the Argo array, and then so half of 1,000 BGC floats is 500 floats. And then so the GO-BGC project was funded to deploy about 500 BGC profiling floats globally over 6 years. And I say approximately 500 because we've had a couple additions. So it's actually a little bit bigger than 500 right now. We have deployed 237 floats so far. The distribution of the floats is shown in the map in the yellow dots. And all the floats deployed through the GO-BGC program is 5 or 6 sensor floats. And the program is a partnership between these 5 institutions: Monterey, University of Washington, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Woods Hole, and Princeton. All data from GO-BGC and BGC Argo are QC'd and freely available for anyone. The main access point is the Argo Global Data Assembly Center, or the GDAC. And for people accessing data through that portal, we strongly recommend using this SBROF for the synthetic profile file that has already aligned the pressure axes from the various BGC Argo BGC parameters. So it's a very user-friendly format. And there are also monthly snapshots available. So for publications, we recommend using these monthly snapshots, which are associated with the DOI. There are also the One Argo toolbox developed by the PMEL team here in both MATLAB and R. And so that makes accessing and sorting through the Argo data very straightforward. So we highly recommend you give that a try if you have not, and all the code is available through GitHub. For the GO-BGC and the SOCOM projects, we have additional data snapshots twice a year, which we provide derived carbon parameters, so PCO2, DIC, alkalinity, and particulate organic carbon from the floats that are deployed through the SOCOM, the GO-BGC, and a couple other projects that we are involved in. And so these also have DOIs associated with them. And so if you're interested in these additional parameters, and for not the whole array, but for the US array, you can access the data there. We are also building a data FAQ page. And so there are some still caveats in the data, that we believe the data is, very high quality, that's validated through many shipboard measurements. But so some of the nitty-gritty details and common questions that we get, we are building a FAQ page so that this would be hopefully kind of a one-stop shop for people to get an idea for what to look out for in the data, and additional considerations that you might have to use when using BGC Argo data. Okay, so this is a hypothetical 1,000 float distributions of BGC Argo floats. And currently, there are 722 operational floats globally. So this is from OceanOps. So if a float has at least one BGC sensor on it, typically oxygen, it counts as a BGC float. Out of that 722, about 497 have 4+ sensors. That's 34 more than the previous webinar we had a couple months ago. And now there are 73 with 6 sensors, which is 7 more. And in this map here, the floats deployed through the SOCOM and GO-BGC projects are shown in yellow, and the international deployments are shown in blue. So we really have reached a global coverage, so that really enables a lot of the new exciting science that's going to get presented today. In the GO-BGC program, we have deployed 21 floats since the last webinar. We have been very busy. The 2 white boxes show the floats that have been deployed over the past couple of months. So you can see that we have filled in a big gap in the Indian Ocean and also in the South Pacific. And so we will continue to fill in the holes, but it's looking, but these are big holes that we wanted to get. So we're very happy about that. This is a map of the planned deployments over the next 6 months or so, 6 or 8 months. The open symbols are floats that have been deployed recently. So you can see the floats deployed in the Indian and in the South Pacific. And the solid symbols are floats that have been assigned to cruises, and that will get deployed in the next 6 to 8 months. So we have about 100 float deployments planned over the next year. So that's very exciting. But I just wanted to make a point. I made this last time too, but the future of GO-BGC and BGC Argo is still uncertain. There's a lot of thought in the community, from talking to people, and an assumption that BGC Argo will just continue, but that's uncertain still. We have proposals in. A lot of people in the US and internationally are working very hard to get sustained funding for BGC, but nothing has been secured yet. So we just want to make sure that if you all are here in this webinar because you think BGC Argo data is helpful, and so just it will be really helpful if you can be champions for BGC Argo and just keep pushing and telling people how useful the data is. And some concrete things that you all can do to help with this is, one, write proposals using BGC Argo data. The National Science Foundation, one of their metrics of success is proposal pressure using BGC Argo data. So they've invested into the infrastructure for the community. So we want the community to use it. One of the best ways to demonstrate that is through proposals. Another way is to write papers as well. That's another metric. And finally, please cite us properly. We use the citations in the papers to track the number of publications, so that just helps us track the use of the data more accurately. The final slide I have is we are organizing a BGC Argo Science Workshop next summer. This is going to take place at the University of Washington, and we have the date set August 11th to the 15th. It's going to be a 4 to 5 day hackathon style workshop, and that will include a tour of the UW Float Lab. And so we are currently working on save the date emails. So please keep an eye out. If it goes to spam, check your spam folders. But it would be great to reply if you can all reply to the save the date if you plan on attending, so we can kind of get a feel for the interest and size of this workshop. And then John, you're up.
Yeah, so hi everybody. I just wanted to give a really quick plug for a new webinar series that's starting up. And this is relevant to this topic of using AI with BGC Argo. So this series is hosted by the 4D BGC working group, which I'm a co-chair of. And this is a group funded by SCORE that coordinates the development of data products from the BGC Argo float array. So this is a brand new webinar series. We had our first one last month, where we heard about some data mapping in the Mediterranean Sea. And we're planning our next one for next month and planning out into the future of next year. So these webinars are meant to introduce new data products, review techniques that are used to develop products, and explore different questions that these gridded products can answer. So every other month, we're going to record them and post all of them online as well. And so I'll put our website in the chat here, where you can join our mailing list and also see the upcoming webinar schedule. That's it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, John. That's very exciting. And then I'm going to let Ellen introduce our speakers today.
Yes, thanks, Yui and John. My name is Ellen Park. I'm a PhD candidate in the MIT Hui Joint Program, and today's talks are about leveraging BGC Argo and machine learning, which is quite a hot topic right now inside and outside of oceanography. Just a reminder that we'll keep all the questions in the chat or to be answered after both of the talks. So our two speakers today are Colette Kelly and Guillaume Liniger. Colette is a GO-SHIP postdoctoral fellow at the Hole Oceanographic Institution. They hold a BA from Barnard College of Columbia University and a PhD from Stanford University, where they investigated nitrous oxides cycling in marine oxygen minimum zones. Their current research uses artificial intelligence and autonomous sensor data to understand the air-sea gas exchange of climatically relevant gases. And then our second speaker is Guillaume, and he is a SOCOM postdoc fellow at MBARI, working in the carbon group with Ken Johnson and Yui Takeshita. His background is originally in oceanography and marine environment. He holds a PhD from the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart, Australia, where he worked on phytoplankton bloom dynamics in Arctic polynyas. His research interests include ocean biogeochemistry, carbon export, temporal and spatial variability, cryosphere effects on primary productivity, programming skills, and use of remote sensing instruments to explore these relationships. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Colette to get us started.
Okay, share my screen. Okay, can everybody see the right view of my slides? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Colette. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about my research on storm-driven nitrous oxide fluxes in the Southern Ocean using BGC Argo data. So for folks who are not familiar with nitrous oxide, this is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It has a global warming potential about 300 times that of carbon dioxide. It's also a key metabolite in the nitrogen cycle. Slides are not advancing, sorry. There we go. Okay. And just like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide is increasing in the atmosphere. So this is just the increase in the atmospheric mixing ratio of nitrous oxide in different zonal bins starting in the 80s. Oh my gosh, having trouble slide advancing. Okay. So marine nitrous oxide emissions are really interesting because they exhibit really sharp spatial gradients and temporal variability. So here on the left, I'm showing a figure of surface nitrous oxide concentrations that were measured in the Eastern Tropical South Pacific. And I'll just draw your attention to the really sharp spatial gradients in there. And on the right, I'm showing a time series of nitrous oxide emissions off the coast of California, estimated 2 different ways. And instead of focusing on the difference between these 2 methods, I'll just highlight the really fine scales of temporal variability that nitrous oxide emissions are operating on here. So it's because of these really fine scales of variability, it's really difficult to estimate the marine nitrous oxide source to the atmosphere. And this is really important to constrain because the ocean is a significant source of nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. But different estimates of this source have both really large uncertainties kind of unto themselves, and they also tend to disagree with each other. There are a couple of reasons for this. estimates of the marine nitrous oxide source that are based on shipboard observations are limited by sparse data coverage, too few repeat observations to resolve seasonal dynamics, the impracticality of going to high latitude regions in the wintertime, as well as the impracticality of sampling within low pressure storms. And that's going to become important later. There are also estimates of the marine nitrous oxide source that are based on global biogeochemical models. But right now, these models are limited by overly simple parameterizations of the nitrogen cycle and thus also the nitrous oxide cycle. And they tend to be a little bit too coarse to capture these really fine scales of variability that these fluxes operate on. So we set out to use machine learning and BGC Argo data to quantify the source of nitrous oxide from the Southern Ocean. And we chose the Southern Ocean specifically because it's an important sink of carbon dioxide. And we wanted to know how much of this carbon dioxide sink is offset by nitrous oxide outgassing. These are the only equations I'll show today, but we wanted to also understand what the drivers were of nitrous oxide outgassing in the Southern Ocean. And kind of generally speaking, the flux is going to be governed by some diffusive component and some bubble-mediated component of air-sea gas exchange. And this diffusive component depends on the air-sea disequilibrium in the nitrous oxide partial pressure, which is in turn driven in part by the barometric pressure. And we thought that this might end up being an important term because in the Southern Ocean, we have these really intense low pressure storms that come through every 5 to 6 days. And actually, I don't have any figures from it, but Magdalena has an excellent paper on storm-driven carbon dioxide fluxes. So we thought that maybe there would be a similar thing happening with nitrous oxide. And the way we went about answering this question is by training machine learning models on a global nitrous oxide data set from the GO-SHIP program. So these are all of the GO-SHIP lines that we have nitrous oxide data from, and I've just colored the points by the air-sea disequilibrium just to show that we've really captured a pretty wide dynamic range in this GO-SHIP data set. And I'll just say this data set was an incredible amount of work by a ton of different people. It's about 35,000 data points, each of which took half an hour to run. So this is a really incredible data set that we're working with. Okay, and then we applied our models to biogeochemical Argo float data. And another inspiration for this work was Allison's paper showing that the floats can give you insight into components of air-sea gas exchange that you're missing with shipboard data. And we thought that maybe something would be true for nitrous oxide as well. So part of the reason why this all works is that nitrous oxide is really predictable from temperature, salinity, oxygen, and nitrate. So here I'm just showing the feature importances and the performance of our random forest model, which we trained to predict nitrous oxide partial pressures, P and N2O, from these 4 variables. And by far, it's really driven by oxygen or apparent oxygen utilization. And we took these models and applied them to Argo floats. And here I'm just showing our GO-SHIP nitrous oxide lines from the Southern Ocean, and then all of the BGC Argo float profiles that we have predicted N2O from, just to kind of really visually emphasize how much more data we have when we use the BGC Argo float data. Here I'm just showing the decorrelation length and time scales for different Southern Ocean zones, as well as the number of profiles we have in each zone and each month, just to really kind of hammer home the point that we have really nice, even coverage in each Southern Ocean zone and each month from our BGC Argo float data set and the predicted N2O associated with that data. So the first thing that became really obvious to us is that there are these hotspots of nitrous oxide outgassing that tend to occur where there are low barometric pressures. So this map is the barometric pressures or sea level pressures that correspond to each of our float profiles, and they're colored by the sea level pressure. And we can see these yellow dots are places where the sea level pressure got as low as 8% below the climatological mean. So super low barometric pressures. The dots are sized by the air-sea flux, and so the yellow dots tend to also be the big dots. Here we're looking at the N2O disequilibrium, and again, we have these hot spots of disequilibrium. And this is looking at the air-sea flux. Again, we have these kind of hot spots of flux. The last thing is the difference in flux calculated with the real barometric pressures, the real sea level pressures, versus assuming a barometric pressure of 1 atmosphere. And what's really interesting is that the difference between these two fluxes is of a similar order of magnitude as the fluxes themselves, which is kind of our first insight into the importance of barometric pressure in governing the air-sea gas exchange of nitrous oxide in the Southern Ocean. And this is because with the float data, we're capturing fluxes that are happening in the center of low pressure storms. So here I'm showing just one of these low pressure extratropical cyclones moving over the location where we have a float profile. Here's another example of this. And whenever we saw this happen, we saw a really intense air-sea disequilibrium of nitrous oxide and thus really high fluxes. One thing that's really interesting is that the floats, like I said before, can pop up in the middle of a storm. They don't really care whether they're sampling in the center of a storm, whereas on a ship, you would rarely, if ever, capture these kind of low pressure stormy conditions. And indeed, this plays out when we look at just histograms of the barometric pressures in our float data set versus our shipboard data set. You can really see that we're capturing this extreme low end in the float data that's not captured by the shipboard data. So when we take all of our float-based nitrous oxide fluxes and we order them by sea level pressure, and then we calculate the cumulative flux using the real barometric pressure, which is the blue, versus assuming 1 atmosphere of barometric pressure, which is the black, we see that this pressure effect accounts for 52% of the total Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source. Or in other words, the difference between these two curves corresponds to about 52% of the total Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source. Another way of looking at this is by saying, okay, how much of the cumulative flux is occurring below the median barometric pressure in our data set? So here in the red line, we have the median barometric pressure. This is the nitrous oxide flux that corresponds to that median pressure. And we see that 76% of the total integrated Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source is occurring below the median barometric pressure in our data set. So what I really tried to hammer home here is that this pressure effect, due to these low pressures in the middle of storms, is responsible for driving a really large component of the overall Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source. And this is really important because this is a component of the flux that previous estimates missed out on because they were either based directly on shipboard estimates that weren't able to capture these low pressure storms, or they were based on very smoothed barometric pressure climatologies, and thus also didn't capture these low pressures in storms. So the second part of our story looks at what the seasonal cycle in Southern Ocean nitrous oxide emissions is. And here I'm showing just our overall integrated nitrous oxide flux from the Southern Ocean in each month. And here I've shaded in gray the wintertime months. And overall, we have this kind of autumnal peak in fluxes, but we certainly have some kind of seasonal asymmetry in the nitrous oxide fluxes. And when we break this down by zone, we see that there's either a fall or a wintertime peak in the nitrous oxide disequilibrium in some zones, and thus also the flux. So in the subantarctic zone, we have this kind of fall or wintertime peak in the N2O disequilibrium. Here, the solid line is the disequilibrium calculated with the real barometric pressure, and the dashed is nitrous oxide disequilibrium calculated with 1 atmosphere of barometric pressure. And we have this wintertime peak in the disequilibrium that also corresponds to a peak in flux. Sort of a similar story for the Antarctic southern zone in that we do have a wintertime peak in flux. And in the polar frontal zone, we have kind of this fall peak in flux. In the southern ice zone, we have this really big peak in N2O disequilibrium in the wintertime. But because of the capping effect of sea ice, we end up not seeing a corresponding peak in flux. And so here I'm showing you the actual flux in the solid line, and this thin line is what the flux would be if we removed the capping effect of sea ice. So the point here primarily is that if you only look at summertime data, you're probably going to get an underestimate of the overall Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source. And then a secondary point is that if you're assuming 1 atmosphere of barometric pressure when you calculate disequilibrium and flux, you're also going to get an underestimate of the overall Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source. And indeed, when we look at our estimate of nitrous oxide emissions from the Southern Ocean and we compare it to this previous study that relied on a shipboard data set that was biased towards the summertime and very smooth barometric pressure fields, we see that our estimate of the Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source and thus the carbon dioxide uptake offset, our estimate is much bigger. This is what this previous study was estimating. Interestingly, when we look at our estimate of the Southern Ocean nitrous oxide source, assuming 1 atmosphere of barometric pressure, or assuming 1 atmosphere of barometric pressure, and also only taking the summertime data into account, our float-based number is within error of this previous estimate. And in fact, it matches up pretty well. So this is a good control on this whole method of applying machine learning to float data to kind of predict N2O. And what we find, there we go. What we find is if you take the real barometric pressure into account and you take wintertime data into account, the Southern Ocean is a much bigger source of nitrous oxide than previous studies would suggest, and thus also less of a net greenhouse gas sink. Okay, I'll just thank all of our funding, and I guess we're doing questions at the end, so thanks everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Colette. That was great. Yeah, you can leave any questions for Colette in the chat, and you can answer them during the presentation or in the Q&A. And Guillaume, do you want to share your screen?
Yep. Okay. Can you see my mouse as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thanks, Hélène. Thanks very much, Colette. Great talk. So as Hélène said, I'm a postdoc researcher here at Monterey. It's been over a year and a half. I've given this talk a couple of times now, but it keeps being updated. So if you've seen it before, watch out for new results. And if you have not, welcome. So I'll be talking about leveraging BGC Argo Float and NI to investigate ANCP patterns in the Southern Ocean. Okay, great. So as you know, the Southern Ocean plays a significant role in the global circulation and atmospheric pattern, and that's something that has been shown both in observation and modeling. And so here's just a quick collection of figures highlighting this, where we started the top left panel, this decrease in FCO2 3 times. On the right-hand side, we got a very long time series of negative air CO2 fluxes and sea air PCO2 difference that's been negative from the late 80s. And then the bottom left highlight the CO2 flux trend, both in simulation and PCO2 products, this very negative trend, meaning there's more absorption in the ocean. So the Southern Ocean acts as a carbon sink. And there's different ways for the ocean to absorb this carbon. It can happen through the solubility pump or the physical pump, the calcium carbonate counterpump, or the BCP, the biological carbon pump, which is the one we focus on today. So as the summer season strikes, phytoplankton growth, photosynthesize, absorbing carbon, and then these POC fluxes go through the water column, exporting at depth, which can also be remineralized by heterotrophic activity, and then through upwelling being put back in the carbon cycle. And if we do the difference between this carbon production by the phytoplankton and the remineralization, we obtain the carbon export, or NCP or ANCP. And so constraining these NCP and NCP estimates is a very efficient way to understand the trajectory, the future trajectory of the CO2 fluxes in the ocean. And on top of that, a recent study showed that without this organic carbon, without the BCP, the Southern Ocean would be a CO2 source to the atmosphere, emphasizing its importance in the Southern Ocean. Now, when it comes to phytoplankton, one key element is nitrate, which in the ocean is consumed in about near proportion with carbon, especially in the Southern Ocean, and it's a key limiting factor for the growth. So therefore, its availability and distribution strongly impact the primary productivity pattern that we can observe and the subsequent carbon export and everything that's happened with the megafauna. Now, historically, if we look at the QC nitrate data from shipboard observation, which is highlighted on the right plot, we observe a pretty good spatial distribution. But then if you look at the temporal coverage, we see that it's heavily biased during summer and autumn for all the reasons that were highlighted in Colette's great talk. And so one way to overcome these temporal issues is to use the BGC Argo floats. So again, we got a distribution of all the good QC nitrate data obtained from the float from January 2012 to September 2023. And the top left plot shows this very nice even distribution throughout the entire year. Now, if we take a quick glance at the study that used the nitrate data to derive ANCP/carbon exports, what we observe is that either not so many were used, but there's still gaps remaining. And so even though it had drastically increased the spatial and temporal coverage, there's still gap remaining. And so one way to overcome this is to create a greedy data set. If we get a greedy data set, then we can very specifically investigate the primary productivity patterns. It will also help resolving any interannual variability and seasonal variability. And some past studies have used AI and machine learning to do that, either to just derive BGC parameters, such as all the different algorithms with Canyon, Canyon-B, and Esper, or through machine learning with the creation of 4D products, such as the Go-BGC Oxygen or DIC product. So very simply, what we want to do here is to use the very high and spatial resolution of the BGC Argo dataset and combine it with the machine learning to investigate in a very consistent spatial and temporal way the patterns of ANCP in the Southern Ocean using nitrate. Now, how do we do this? So we train 5 different neural networks to predict nitrate. So we take our BGC Argo float dataset, which is about 300 floats from 2012 to 2023. We use 80% for the training and we retain 20% for the testing. So we have this whole bunch of different predictors that we put in our different neural network and that predict nitrate. So we tried a whole different bunch of combination and ended up with 7 predictors So when we try that, basically the idea is to come with a nice trade-off between the number of predictors that we use and the robustness of the model prediction. And so we use latitude, longitude, time, temperature, salinity, pressure, and AOU. So for this study, we trained the 5 different neural networks, and we use the average output of the 5 as the main product of nitrate that we use to derive ANCP. So there was a whole part of the model validation, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through it. But if you have questions at the end, please feel free. I can show all the validation afterwards. Okay, so we train our model. We have our output. Now, how do we go from having this model to the nice gridded nitrate data set? So 3 years ago, there's the GO-BGC product that was released by Sharp et al. And it turns out that this data set has oxygen that we turn into AOU, temperature, and salinity, which is highlighted on the left side. And because every grid cell also has a latitude, a longitude, and a time, we get all the predictors that we need. So we just use the GO-BGC dataset as a new input in our newly trained model. And we end up with a 4-dimensional nitrate dataset spanning 2004 to 2022 at a 1 by 1 degree. So here's just a quick animation of the surface nitrate in the Southern Ocean. So we can see the nice little seasonal cycle. When winter comes, nitrate is replenished. And when the summer bloom period arrives, nitrate is being drawn down and phytoplankton bloom happens. Okay, so now we go from this 4D product to ANCP. We simply use the nitrate drawdown, the seasonal nitrate drawdown. So we take the maximum winter concentration minus the minimum summer concentration. We integrate the difference in depth, and we convert to carbon using a rate fill ratio. So we do that for the 18 years of data that we got, and we get this climatological SNCP for seasonal NCP from sunny in the Southern Ocean. So what we observe is at the lowest latitude, this is where we get the lowest productivity, between 30 and 40 south. And then as we go south between 45 and 55, this is where we get the highest ANCP observed. So here it's called ANCP, but it really is SNCP. And this happens mostly around terrestrial area, next to South America, Kerguelen, south of Tassie, and New Zealand. Now, as a comparison, we did the exact same analysis using the BGC model output. So using the nitrate, calculating the drawdown, and mapping the climatology. And so here we also observe that from the BGC output using the same method, between the 45 and the 55, we do have the same pattern when it is higher, although it's slightly lower in magnitude. So now one issue is that we're using the seasonal drawdown. So it's not the actual annual NCP. And so one way to try to correct for this is to look at what the true annual NCP would look like. And so from the same BGC model, we take the NCP output, which this time we integrate throughout the entire year, giving us ANCP. And the reason we also do that is because it can potentially help us correcting for spurious and physical effects that are not accounted for in SONY. Also, sorry, I should have mentioned that SONY is Southern Ocean Nitrate Estimates. It's just the name that we gave to the model. And so to try to correct for this, we apply what we call the BGC factor. So we correct SONY from the true ANCP by basically getting the BGC ANCP, which is panel C, calculated from the BGC NCP, divided by the BGC SNCP, which is panel B, calculated from the BGC nitrate drawdown. And so we do that for the 9 years of data, end up with a climatological correction factor, which is highlighted here. So first of all, if we just focus on the temporal changes, which is the panel C, we see that this correction factor is very consistent throughout time, which is about 1.6 mole of carbon per meter square per year. But one of the key things is the difference in spatial distribution. We see that between SNCP and ANCP in the model, it's pretty similar if we look at the lower latitude between 30 and 40. And then the discrepancies occurs when we go just down of 50 south. And in red are just the ossifrons for information. So what we did is that we applied this climatological spatial correction for the 18 years of Sony SNCP data that we have. And we end up with a corrected, this time, climatological ANCP from Sony with the mean absolute deviation plotted on the right-hand side. And so what we observe is that it's the same spatial pattern with the lowest, again, values obtained in the lowest latitude, and then it increases in this 4550. And the main difference is that there's a big peak in ANCP near the Patagonian shelf and south of South America. And we also highlight that where we got this highest ANCP is also where we got the highest uncertainty and difference in the mean absolute deviation in our estimates. And if we average everything, we end up with an estimate of 3.55 mole of carbon per meter square per year and a 3.9 petagram of carbon. Now, if you want to see if our data makes sense and we compare it to the previous studies, so this is just a little combination of everything that has been done before, showing the meridional pattern of NCP in mole of carbon per meter square per year, binned every 5 degrees. The previous studies are in black and our study is in blue. We see that we have very similar pattern. We got the lowest, as I said, between the 30 and 35, then increasing around the fronts, 45, 55, and decreasing as we go towards the CI zone. So we observe similar pattern as previous observation. And now in terms of global estimates, we did the same comparing with previous studies. So the uncorrected Sony, which is Sony SNCP, had an estimate of 2.45 petagram of carbon, which is towards the lower end of all the previous estimates. And when corrected, ends up with 3.9, getting into the higher end, comparing with the Pan, Su, and Lee. And the interesting fact here is that the corrected factor given as 3.5 is very close to the latest study, Pan 2023. We also used machine learning in deriving DIC and DIC drawdown to estimate ANCP in the Southern Ocean. Okay, so now you also the title. So yes, if we do an average of this corrected Southern Ocean estimate, whether it's per area or area integrated, it seems like we have a slight increasing trend in ANCP in the Southern Ocean. So here I'm not showing the errors to show the internal viability, but I can show the plot later if you'd like. But there's some rather significant deviation, as you could imagine from the climatological plot that I showed you just before. And so this increase in Southern Ocean productivity is consistent with previous studies that show increase of surface chlorophyll concentration or even in model. So now if we look at just the spatial distribution, we see that this increase happens again mostly around the 45-55, which is highlighted in red for an increase in ANCP and in blue for a decrease in ANCP. And if we just compare with all the previous studies, which an increase is highlighted in red, we see that this is what's happening. So with surface chlorophyll, Zalei, tomalinal with the bloom magnitude and the bloom mean chlorophyll trend, mean assembled model from SU 2024 showed an increase of relative change in surface chlorophyll, the Hansen, and also in model where this time the colors are just inverted and blue means an increase and red means a decrease. So there's evidence of the Southern Ocean getting greener in both observation, modeling, which is consistent with what we observe. Okay, now when it comes to uncertainty, we consider 2 different sources. The first source is from the model. So as you may recall, I said that we trained 5 different models and we took the output, the average of the output as the main product that we used to derive ANCP. And so to quantify the nitrate uncertainties from this, we just took the standard deviation throughout the 5 different models that we have. And this is our uncertainty from the model. Now from the go-by, it's a tiny bit trickier. So what we did is we took the value of the dissolved oxygen for every grid cell every year, every month. And all these specific grid cell comes with assigned uncertainty. So what we did is we derived potential new dissolved oxygen value for each grid cell according to the uncertainty. We did that 5 times to get 5 new grid of GO-BY, and then we ran the same analysis. We derived 5 new grid of nitrate from each different new dissolved oxygen value, and we looked at the standard deviation across these 5 different models. And what we see here, it's that the greatest, and then the combination of these uncertainties is the quadrature of the uncertainty in GO-BY and SUNY. And what we observe is that the uncertainty in GO-BY is greater than the uncertainty from the model. Meaning that the model is good, and that if there's any source of uncertainty, it comes from the data that is used from the dissolved oxygen. Which sort of makes sense, because if we look back at the GO-BY O2 product, the main uncertainty came from the predicted oxygen. Okay, so if you have to go home and remind a couple of stuff from this, is that we developed an algorithm to predict nitrate in the Southern Ocean using the high temporal and spatial resolution of the BGC Argo float nitrate data collected year-round. Seems like our algorithm captures the spatial and the temporal variability of the observed nitrate in ANCP. And when we calculate the net community from the nitrate drawdown and we correct it, it seems that there's an increase from 2004 to 2022 in the Southern Ocean. And so currently what we're doing is we're trying to find the reasons for that increase, if it is a model artifact or if it's a true signal that is observed. So with that, I'd like to thank Ken, you and John, and all the different funding, SOCOM mostly, for helping me going through this. So far, it's been a blast, though. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Guillaume. That was a great talk. Now we'll move over to the Q&A session. We have about 12 minutes. So I know there's some questions in the chat, which I can read out, or if people prefer to unmute and ask, that also works. Okay, I'll just start with the first question in the chat from Taylor. This is for Colette. Looks like knowing barometric pressure is very important. So how do you get barometric pressure for float locations, and what are the uncertainties for the pressure value? If floats could measure barometric pressure when they surface, would that improve the N2O flux estimates?
Yeah, so we are using the ERA5 reanalysis mean sea level pressures, and just doing a interpolation in space and time from the ERA5 6-hour mean sea level pressures to the floats. I don't know exactly what the reported uncertainty is for the ERA5 pressures, but I think the most relevant, the most relevant uncertainty would be, any kind of uncertainty associated with that interpolation, which again, we haven't assessed, but I think it's probably because we have enough float profiles, we're probably getting a pretty representative sample. In terms of how that affects the flux and the uncertainty in the uncertainty in the flux is really just primarily driven by the uncertainty in the parameterization of air-sea gas exchange. And so while some uncertainty in barometric pressure would propagate out into some probably small component of uncertainty in the flux, the main source of uncertainty for the air-sea flux is just the subjectivity in the parameterization of gas exchange.
Adam, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. As for Guillaume, I think you said that you had like the predictors there for nitrate, and I was just I think you didn't have chlorophyll and backscattering. I was just wondering why you decided not to include those.
Yes, so I tried with chlorophyll and backscatter. So at first, I did a sort of, I took everything first, then removing one by one.
sort of. And so adding chlorophyll and backscatter did not improve the model whatsoever. So it's, again, a compromise. I could have left them, but the issue is if someone wants to actually use our algorithm, they would need chlorophyll and backscatter more, which is a bit more sparse. So if you only rely on oxygen, basically, it's much easier for everybody to use it, because the idea is also for everybody to be able to use the algorithm if they need it.
I got a quick follow-up question. When you included backscatter, I'm just curious to know, did you like de-spike it
Yes.
before you used it as okay? Okay,
Yeah.
cool, thanks.
John, do you want to go? We'll just go with the.
Yeah, sure. Since I had my question in the chat too, I figured I'd ask it. Colette, yeah, really cool work. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, when I have done work before with machine learning regression, trying to reconstruct things, kind of like the extreme values get moderated. And since you have these extreme, or it seems like you have a lot of extreme kind of N2O efflux values, I was wondering if you thought that, maybe those were still, getting moderated by your RFR predictions and might actually still be underestimating the efflux in the Southern Ocean.
Yes, that's a really good question / point. If we were training the model on N2O disequilibrium, which is the parameter that includes the barometric pressure, then yes, I would be worried that the model would be underestimating the extreme values in disequilibrium. But what we're training the model on and what we're predicting is actually just the surface partial pressure of N2O, which tends to be fairly uniform in the Southern Ocean. That kind of model performance figure that I showed was our model performance for the full training data set, which does include extreme values of PN2O, but those tend to be in the oxygen minimum zones. So there is still, that's still a valid point. And certainly, like, one of the things that we've been looking at a lot is trying to minimize overfitting and scale compression effects. But because we're training the model on PN2O as opposed to the disequilibrium, it should be agnostic to these barometric pressure driven extremes in the disequilibrium and flux.
Cool, thanks.
Lynn, do you want to go?
Hi, both amazing talks. Thank you very much. I put my question for Guillaume in the chat, just was looking at the spatial pattern of the greening that you showed there, and noticing there's also a ungreening in the regions where the pump is the strongest, say the Argentine Basin and all that.
Yep.
And so that isn't something we really focus on. We say, oh, the Southern Ocean is greening, but that seems important, that the area that is the most active is decreasing, and the area that is sort of, wimpy and least active is increasing. You have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I've been trying to, yes, I can show the plot again so people can see what you're talking about. So it's okay, so the greening basically, when it's corrected, is here, and then when you look at the trends, it seems like it's decreasing. So I think that's why I wonder if the trends that we saw is a model artifact as well. And it's actually not the true signal is observed, but truth be told, I haven't really wrapped my hand around it, understanding what's happening.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I wrote the question down before your last slide, which says to be investigated. So that's great. Thanks.
I'll do the one question from the chat from, I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, Yana. This is for Colette. Do you think that nitrous oxide emissions are also underestimated in other regions due to the same shortcomings of shipboard data?
The short answer is yes. Although what kind of I was alluding to with the answer to John's question is the Southern Ocean is somewhat unique in that the surface N2O concentrations are actually quite uniform. And so this barometric pressure story is probably more important in the Southern Ocean, whereas like in oxygen minimum zones, for example, where there are also hotspots of N2O flux, that's more likely to be driven by really high surface saturations. But that being said, like there's probably a component of that we're missing from the shipboard data that float data would potentially allow us to capture. So, and then of course there are other very stormy parts of the ocean, like the Labrador Sea, where this barometric pressure story might also be relevant.
Ken, do you want to go?
Sure. A question for Colette. So I was wondering, when you have these big outgassing events, is that enough to reduce the nitrous oxide concentration, perceptibly? And where I'm really going with that is, if you look at the shipboard data and look in the, when ships cross the wake of a storm, do you actually see a depression, kind of way to validate, the high outgassing fluxes? Can you actually see that as a low signature in the wake of a storm, since ships avoid the storms, but they might cross the wake of a storm?
That's a really good question. And I actually haven't done that analysis of how much does the outgassing compare to the amount of N2O in the water. So thank you.
Yeah. Something to do in your spare time.
Okay, there's another question for Colette in the chat from Allison. Are there atmospheric data-based estimates of the air-sea nitrous oxide fluxes, and do these align with the larger Southern Ocean fluxes you find?
There are a handful. They're not nearly as many as there are for carbon dioxide. For the Southern Ocean, there is one paper that was published in 2005 that tries to use an atmospheric data-based estimate of N2O flux, and there they use data from just one monitoring station, forget which one. Interestingly, they do see a similar kind of seasonal cycle to what we see, but their estimate of the Southern Ocean N2O source is somewhat smaller than ours. Not super surprising that there's some disagreement there, given that they're kind of inferring, or it's this kind of complicated process where they're kind of taking the seasonal cycle they measure in this one location, and they're then matching it to biogeochemical model output. But there certainly isn't the level of atmospheric data-based estimates that you would have for carbon dioxide.
Okay, great. That was a great discussion. We're right at the end of the hour, so wanted to thank both of our speakers for great talks and for everyone for participating, and definitely come to the next one next year.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ellen.